Over the last 18 years, my studio setup, my gear, and my space have changed a lot. And this was my very first studio setup right around the middle of 2006. And I got pretty lucky in two different ways. For one, at this point, I was just months away from going to college for audio engineering, but I kept having doubts about doing that because everyone I knew who was coming out of the college wasn't having any success in the studio. And to boot, their stuff didn't even sound good at all. Now, at the same time, a friend of mine wanted to get rid of all of his gear in his studio space, and I don't know why, but my parents agreed to give me a loan for $6,500 to buy all of his gear and try to figure this thing out on my own. Now, the even luckier thing was that my friend, he was renting a detached garage that a local guy in town had converted into a studio. It was on this kind of farm property out in the country, and it had a small live room. This is it right here, and that small live room also doubled as our band practice space. And there was a little hallway with a closet at the end that doubled as a vocal booth, and a small control room, very small, probably not even 10 feet by 10 feet. Now, at this point starting out, I had no idea what I was doing. Like, I had a lot of confidence in my ear that I had a good ear for good sounds and good mixes, but it turned out to be a lot harder than I expected to get those sounds out of the speakers. Now, at first, literally all I knew how to do was to plug in a mic and get a signal into Pro Tools and record. I didn't really know what plugins were. I didn't know much about EQ, or I didn't understand compression. And even though my recordings were absolutely terrible, there was something special about those days of just trying to find a good tone, record it, and then when it came time to mix, all that was pretty much just balancing faders. So here's that first setup again. So there was a PC that was custom built into a rack there, a Digi 002 interface. This was before it became Avid. A Behringer console here. This really, I just used the preamps, and they gave me an additional 8 inputs via ADAT. I had Behringer monitors and a Behringer headphone amp. And the mics I initially had that I bought off my friend were a set of Sennheiser E604s, which are still my favorite tom mics. I had a 57, I had some cheap Audix small diaphragm condensers, and this Behringer fancy-looking condenser mic here. Here's some photos I found of my brilliant mic technique from those days. You can see I'm using a couple tom mics placed almost outside of the edge of the speaker. Now, after a few months in that space, I started to streamline the setup a bit. First thing I did was I swapped out those Behringers for Yamaha HS80s, and I replaced that big Behringer console mixer with this Focusrite Octopre, so I still had an additional 8 preamps via ADAT, and I bought my first really cool fancy piece of outboard, which was this Avalon 737 preamp channel strip, and I knew it had to be good because I always saw it in the racks of pro studios, and it did have tubes after all. I also bought a Royer ribbon mic. This was my first serious mic purchase at the time, which promptly needed to be repaired after I allowed a trumpet to blow air directly into the ribbon. And by the way, the fact that I'm using 3 microphones on a trumpet and not a single piece of room treatment in sight shows you how much I didn't know what the heck I was doing. But that was a fun first year and a half. We had an awesome local music scene at the time. All of my friends were in bands. I was in bands. I got to record a lot of these local bands. And this is just something I was doing for $50 or $100 a song on the side while I was working full-time at an Esso gas station. Now, at first, I didn't really care that my stuff sucked and didn't sound good. It was all kind of new and fun still. But after that year and a half, the fact that my stuff still sounded like trash, it was starting to bother me. And those fancy gear purchases that I had made, they hadn't moved the needle at all. So I realized that, hey, I actually need to go and learn some stuff. Now, keep in mind, this was right around the birth of YouTube. So there were not any online courses, there were not any online tutorials available for this stuff. But I was lucky enough to get a paid internship gig at Cherry Beach Studios in Toronto. And I learned a lot from watching the head engineer run a bunch of sessions there. I got to be in the room with Usher and Timbaland. I talked to famous engineer Jimmy Douglas. And I even watched a Jonas Brothers record get made, and I drove them around Toronto in my car. But in the end, having a job at a commercial studio, it wasn't for me. My dream was to make a name for myself as a producer. So with the upgraded knowledge I got from that 6-month internship, I decided I was ready to risk it all and try to go full-time back in my studio. And that was January 2008. And that was when I made some pretty huge changes to my gear. But before I show you that, I just want to make sure that you know about my free mixing cheat sheet, which you can download at mixcheatsheet.com. There's a link below as well. And it just shows you all of my go-to EQ and compression settings as a starting point for every track in your mix, like all your drum tracks, your bass, guitar, your vocals. It'll show you exactly where to look to enhance and remove problems and to really just make the sound jump out of the speakers and get you closer to that professional polished sound. So go grab that. It's free, mixcheatsheet.com. So I've been so fortunate to have extremely supportive parents. Over those first 2 years, I had been paying back that initial startup loan that they gave me. And when I decided to go full-time, my dad surprised me with a $20,000 investment into my studio, my new full-time business, which was totally unexpected and totally undeserved based on, the skill and quality I was doing at the time. But I'm so thankful for that support. And I used that to totally upgrade my setup. So one of the first things I did was I got a Pro Tools HD system and a new Mac Pro. I remember actually having delay compensation. Back in the day with Pro Tools LE with the 002, they didn't have delay compensation. So as soon as I turned that on with the HD rig, it was like everything started sounding so much punchier and glued together. And since I didn't need the 002 as an interface, I got rid of that and I got this Command 8 controller because I've always loved having physical faders in front of me. I had a Mackie Big Knob for talkback and headphones and monitor management. And here's the really exciting stuff. I ditched that Avalon preamp. I had learned by that time that thing wasn't actually really cool and popular with real engineers. And so I got this API 3124 4-channel preamp, which ended up being my favorite preamp for many years. I still love that unit. Below that is a Vintech 273. This is a Neve 1073 clone, 2 channels, that I never really loved and eventually sold. Still had the Octopre for extra inputs, and you can barely see it, but that's a DBX 160 compressor, a really old one that I grabbed super cheap, and it was actually pretty awesome on vocals. I also wanted to jazz up the space a bit, so I enlisted some friends and family to help me paint it red, and I put down a laminate floor over the carpet, so it had a much cooler vibe now. And I finally spent a bit more and upgraded my mic collection, and the biggest purchase I remember making was this Neumann U87, which turned out to be a waste of money too. But I also grabbed a pair of AKG C451s, those small diaphragm mics there. And to this day, those are still some of my favorite mics for cymbals, for overheads, and for acoustic guitar and other acoustic instruments. So I kept grinding away, recording local bands, just making enough money to pay for the rent and to pay for some iced coffees from Starbucks and fast food during sessions. And my work at this point was starting to at least sound better. Maybe you'd call it semi-pro or like a really good demo. And at the time, I was also playing guitar in a band called Kingdoms. I recorded our first EP with that band in the studio. By the way, this looks like it was about when I figured out the SM7B works way better than the U87 for vocals. But I remember having to do a show with the band right around Christmas time, and our tire blew out on the way on the road. We never made it to the show. And we're standing out there in the cold, freezing. I'm wishing that I was just at home. And I realized the lifestyle of being in a serious band, that was just not for me. I didn't enjoy it. And this was December 28th, 2008. And I quit the band very soon after that to double down again on the studio. And things were actually picking up thanks to that Kingdoms EP. It was fairly popular in the local scene. So I was getting more local bands and better local bands coming to my studio. But that control room was so small and it got so hot. Even if it was in the middle of the winter, you get 5 guys in there, a couple amps, and you're working on a record. It was a million degrees in there, so it was kind of brutal. Plus, the soundproofing between the live room and the control room was almost non-existent. So I decided it was time for another round of renos to kick off 2009. So what I did is I tore down a wall to get rid of the hallway and get rid of that closet vocal booth and just make the control room a much bigger space. Here you can see that change from another angle. There's my buddy Phil who did the renos. He's being weird there. And in addition to making that room bigger, we also doubled up the wall in between the live room and control room, and we added a second pane of glass there and also double doors between them to help with the soundproofing. Now, it still always leaked a fair bit of sound, especially when doing drums and loud guitar amps, but it was a noticeable improvement over what I had before. At least I could actually focus on what was coming through the speakers and not what was coming through the wall and the window. I also finally got wise to room treatment, and I put up these bass traps and ceiling clouds, which I did all DIY, and they really made a huge difference in my source tracks, especially the drums. I would put the drums back on that kind of red carpet back there, so I had the most treatment along that wall, the ceiling cloud right where the cymbals and the overhead mics would be, and that full floor to ceiling bass trap there in the corner. this really made a big difference. And here's what the new control room looked like. And I really loved this space. I thought it had a good vibe. It felt great not to have bands crowded in on top of each other in a tiny room. And I was still pretty much rocking all the same gear here. I still had the HS80 monitors, but I had added some go-to guitar amps to the collection. I had a original 5150 and a JCM 800, which either one of those amps I used on pretty much every recording I did in this space. Oh, and I got a distressor too. Now, this was a really special time for me in the studio. One of the first projects after doing that big reno was the Counterparts album, Prophets. Right after that, we did the first Structures EP, and I finally kind of knew what I was doing. It was just good enough to get across that professional line, and those projects really moved the needle because the following year, 2010, I was recording Silverstein in this little converted garage studio in the middle of nowhere, which was terrifying at first. This band had sold ton of records, maybe millions of records. They had worked at some of the best studios in LA with some of the biggest name producers. And here I am, like barely good enough to have my mixes be considered professional. And they were trusting me. And I'm so thankful they gave me a chance because I was able to gain a lot of experience very quickly and improve a lot working with them. And they came back and did 3 more records with me after that first one, which was Rescue. We did 3 more, and most of it we did out of this tiny little studio, believe it or not. And for the next 3 years, things were just rolling. I got to work with a lot of great people and a lot of great bands and labels. I continued to improve during this time. I was finally starting to feel proud of the work I was doing and satisfied with it. And I was so busy recording band after band after band that I really stopped caring about gear at all. And plus, I finally understood what actually mattered. I did add a pair of NS10s. I don't know exactly when I added them, but when I did, it dramatically improved my mixes. I've got lots of content on this channel that you can watch to learn more about why I love NS10 so much. I was still running a Pro Tools HD system. That was all the same, except I had added a 192 converter, which did sound better than the old 96 IO. I got rid of that Vintech 1073 clone, and instead I got this cool Sci-Tech 4-channel preamp. These were just nice, clean, high-quality preamps, but they were less than half the cost of the API. And I don't have a close-up of it, but I actually had 2 of these Sci-Tech units. So that's 8 channels plus 4 from the API. So that in total gave me enough high-quality preamps to handle drums and everything else. And that went into my 192 and then the extra inputs into the 96 IO. By this time, I'd also narrowed down and dialed in my mic collection to a few essential favorites. I had the AKG D112 for kick drum. It was my favorite kick mic. I've tried them all. A couple of 57s, those E604 tom mics, like I said, the 451s I hung on to for overheads. Another small diaphragm, the SM81 for extra cymbals, sometimes hi-hat. I had a pair of large diaphragm condensers, AT4040s. I thought they were fine. They were good enough for what I needed without being super expensive. SM7B for vocals, sometimes for hi-hat and some other things now and then. And I had a Sennheiser MD421, which I hung on to for a while. I did eventually sell it. It actually sounded pretty sweet on vocals when you really wanted a gritty, aggressive vocal sound. It's famous for being the tom mic. I actually never really liked it on toms. I kept trying and I never liked it. And here's a list of mics that I bought and got rid of over the years. U87, an old vintage Geffel mic, some 414s, some Royer ribbon mics. Now it's funny how the list of mics I didn't want to keep were the more expensive ones. And during that same period of time where the studio work was taking off and I was having all this growth, I also got married. We had our first child. We bought our first house. And I also started a side business making iPhone games. This is our first game, which was the best hit game that we made. It was called Stickman Trampoline. So this was a pretty formative time in my life, and it really set the trajectory for everything else. But I also burnt out. Now, I've done another video about that, which you can watch, but basically I was working way too much. I didn't take care of myself. I didn't balance life well, and I started getting interested in other opportunities. And so the first step I took was I stopped accepting any tracking projects. I went to only mixing projects. And after a few months of that, I decided, man, I didn't need to pay rent at the studio. I didn't need all of this gear. I should just get rid of it and move out of the studio. So I sold almost all my mics. I sold my preamps, sold room treatment, some of it at least. I sold a lot of studio furniture, but I kept my Pro Tools rig, I kept my NS10s and my distressor, and I moved it all into a bedroom at our first house. Now, it was definitely a challenge getting used to a really small space again without much isolation from the noise of the rest of the house and even the neighborhood. And plus, I also kind of, to be honest, felt like a fraud for calling myself a pro mixer and having this lame bedroom setup. But believe it or not, this is where I mixed Remarkably Human by Nick Johnston in 2016, which looking back is still one of the mixes I'm most proud of. And this is also where I made my first online course, hardcore mixing, and started making some of my first YouTube videos here. And I thought if I made that course, if a few people bought it, I'd be like, hey, that's cool, I'm happy, and I would just move on to something else. Turns out, though, that course sold a lot better than I thought. Tons of people bought it. And then I started getting messages from people saying how much it was helping them. Like a couple guys are emailing me months after I launched that course saying, man, I've gotten so good, and I've gotten so many clients as a result of getting so good that I've just quit my job. I've just quit my part-time or full-time job, and I'm going full-time in the studio. And so this really kind of lit a fire under me to keep doing this teaching stuff. And one of the biggest gear changes I made around that time was going from that big Pro Tools HD rig, which by the way was worth like $10,000 at the time I bought it, to just an iMac with an Apogee Duet interface. And I actually noticed no difference in terms of my workflow or the quality I was hearing while mixing. And another change I made is I didn't have the control surface anymore. I sold the Command 8. I think because newer versions of Pro Tools, it wasn't compatible anymore. So I sold that thing. And for a while, I just used the single channel PreSonus fader port for automation. Now, I took that exact setup with me to our next house in 2017, but I upgraded to a nicer studio desk. I got some new room treatment instead of the ugly brown panels. I still held on to that distressor, which I really didn't need at all, but I just loved that thing so much I didn't want to lose it. And I missed having the 8 faders, so I got the Avid Artist Mix control surface instead. We lasted only 2 years in that house. I mixed a bit, I made a lot of videos, I made a lot of courses, I had another kid, bought and sold my dream car, which again, there's another video on this channel you can find about that mistake. And I brought that exact setup to our new house on the other side of Toronto, once again in a spare bedroom. Same desk, same gear, same acoustic panels, and I finally sold that distressor after all those years of not using it. Tried to make that room look a little vibier, a little cooler for videos, and I mixed a couple of cool projects in that space for Emery, Auras, Mandroid, Echo Star, and we had another kid, all boys. And that brings us to today. This is my new studio setup in the basement of our house. Actually soundproofed, professionally designed, and with a very streamlined collection of gear. Now you can watch the entire build process and get the final studio tour, including the gear walkthrough, right over here in this playlist. And now I know I keep getting a ton of questions in the comments about these monitors here. What's up with having basically the exact same monitor stacked up behind me? Well, it's really simple. I was using the CLA 10s. I had to replace a woofer in one of them, so I switched to the NS 10s in the meantime, and now I just switch back and forth for fun. And truthfully, I just stacked them up together because I think it's kind of fun to look at and it makes me smile.